Over the past few months, I have made an attempt to work my way through a lot of videos being sent to me by my subscribers asking me to give them feedback. So in today's video, I'm going to react to more of them. So let's get into it. Very nice, and he plays it very, very well, and he has a lot of flexibility in it, which I like, but there are a few things that I definitely think can help improve this piece. So firstly, at the very start of this piece, there is a G sharp in the right hand. We know it's a G sharp rather than a G because there's a G sharp in the key signature, and there's a G sharp in the key of C sharp minor, which is what this piece is in. But interestingly, Edson replayed this G sharp for both of these notes. Now, people often get confused between a tie and a slur, and this here is actually a slur opposed to a tie. And the difference is that a tie is between two of exactly the same note, whereas a slur is between two different notes. And when you have a tie, you've got to join the notes so you're playing it for the duration of both notes together, rather than playing it as two separate notes. So for this opening section, he should be playing a G sharp and then an E while still holding on to this G sharp. And that's something to be careful of because I know a lot of people tend to replay ties by accident. The important thing here is that this melody is actually this top line, so you don't want to lose that by playing this chord too strong, and it's sounding a little bit more like a vertical chord rather than a melody with like a counter melody underneath. So because that melody is so important, it's also kind of important to let this second melody, this sort of counter melody, you've got to try and let this be like an undertone and more of a secondary voice. It doesn't want to feel like it's interfering too much with that top melody note. There's also something important going on here in the music. This chord here is actually really quite a tense chord, and the reason for that is because of something called a suspension. Now, a suspension is where you have notes that aren't in a chord that fall to notes that are in a chord. In this particular case, the chord is actually a G sharp major chord, which is the notes G sharp, B sharp, and D sharp. And it also has an F sharp in there to give you the seventh, or in this case it's something called a dominant seventh. But the A at the top of this chord doesn't belong to this chord, so it adds quite a lot of tension to the chord. That is until the note drops to a note that is in the chord, which is the G sharp. Now, normally when you find any tension in music, but especially with things like suspensions, you want to try and lean on the tension and then relax as you resolve the tension. So in this case, you would lean on the A and then you would relax when you get to the G sharp. This is also a moment in the piece where we get something called a perfect cadence. Now, a perfect cadence is the end of a phrase. It's where you put a full stop or a period. And the reason that we know a phrase has ended is because of the cadence. And a perfect cadence is chord 5 to chord 1. In this case, because we're in C sharp minor, chord 5 is a G sharp chord, and chord 1 is a C sharp minor chord. So in this case, we get that chord 5 followed by chord 1. And the chord 5 in itself adds tension because we feel like it needs to go back to that chord 1. So you get something like... So you can feel like a double release of tension. There's one release of tension where the suspension drops, and then another release of tension when we get to chord 1. So it's really important with pieces like this to feel where the tension is and feel where that tension is released, even if you don't analyze it to death with music theory. For the most part, as you navigate through the piece, you'll be able to feel where things feel tense and where that tension gets released. Just a quick interlude from Future Matt to let you know that these clips that you're seeing are actually all segments from members videos where I completely dissect my subscribers' piano playing from start to finish. So if you are interested in learning a lot more about music, then feel free to support the channel and become a member for some extra content. Okay, back to the video. So interestingly, the key of this piece is A minor, and we can't actually tell that just by looking at the key signature because there's nothing in the key signature. Normally when there's nothing in the key signature, that would tell us that it's C major. However, in this case, it's not in C major, it's in A minor. Now, you might be thinking, how do you know it's in A minor? Well, A minor is the relative minor of C major, which means both A minor and C major have the same notes in their scales. And the way to work out a relative minor is to just go down 3 half steps. So from C, if you go down 3 half steps, you get to A. So C major and A minor share the same notes. Now this means that when you see a key signature in a piece, let's say a piece has 1 sharp in the key signature, that means it could be in G major, or it could actually be in E minor. But how do you know? Well, there's a few ways to tell. The first and most easy way is to look at the first chord in the piece. Now in this particular case, this first bar outlines the first chord, and we have the note A, another A, an E, a C, an A, a C, an E, and a C. This gives us the notes A, C, and E, which is an A minor chord. And normally pieces of music tend to start on chord 1 of the scale. So if it was in C major, that would be a C major chord. If it was in A minor, that would be an A minor chord. When the right hand comes in, we have this repetitive note that's going over the top of all of these notes. In this case, it's a C. However, I would argue that those are more of a rhythmic device and a rhythmic feature, whereas the other notes that are moving are more of a melodic idea. It's descending. And so these are much more important. Now, interestingly, listening to Anton is kind of leaning on that top note. Rather than leaning on the bottom note, whereas the bottom note, I think, is more important. It would also be interesting to hear him try and add the rest of that left hand in. Another interesting feature of this piece is the fact that it's using the circle of fifths. Now, the circle of fifths is important for lots of different things, but it's where you move chords by 5 notes at a time. So, for example, the chord here is an A minor chord. After that, if we go down 5 notes, we get to D, which is the next chord. After that, we go down 5 notes. We get to G, which is the next chord. After that, we go down 5 notes and we get to C, which is the next chord. After that, we go down 5 notes and we get to F, and that's the next chord. And then the pattern breaks. But that pattern is used in so many songs. I mean, the most famous one I can think of is Fly Me to the Moon. It's a very popular pattern because it allows you to seamlessly move through all the keys. Now, if you didn't know, all of the key signatures in music are based on fifths. So C major has no sharps or flats. If you go up 5 notes, you get to G, and that has 1 sharp, up 5 notes. To D, and that has 2 sharps, up 5 notes. To A, and that has 3 sharps, and so on. And you can also go from C backwards to get your flats, so down 5 notes gives you F, which is 1 flat. Down 5 notes gets B flat, which is 2 flats. Down 5 more notes gives you E flat, and E flat major has 3 flats, and so on. So when you play a series of chords that essentially move by 5 notes at a time, you are in essence moving through all of the different keys. But you're doing it in a way that isn't that jarring to listen to. The interesting thing about the circle of fifths and when you use the circle of fifths is that it feels kind of like it's syncing. So in this case, you get A minor to D minor, and then G major to C major, and that is kind of moving down one step at a time. And so this gives you an opportunity within the music to kind of sync with it, especially as this top note is syncing as well. So this piece has been written in the key of D major, which means the scale that's been used is a D major scale, and the notes in the D major scale are D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, and C sharp. And interestingly, the first technique he is using in the left hand is a technique that I've mentioned quite a few times on my channel, and that is using tenths. So this is where you play just a normal triad chord, but you take the middle note out of the chord and you play it an octave higher. So you play D, A, F sharp rather than D, F sharp, A. Now, the interesting thing about tenths in the left hand is that the middle note of a chord tends to be the quality of sound note. If we have the chord D, F sharp, and A, which is a D major chord, and chord number 1 in the scale of D major, then this note here is the note that gives it its quality of sound. It's the note that makes it either major or minor. If we dropped that F sharp to D, F, and A, then that would become a D minor chord, and that would change the quality of sound completely. But because that is the quality of sound note, and it's the note that gives the chord its tonality, when you put this at the top instead, so you get D, A, F sharp, this top note stands out a little bit more, and therefore you hear that kind of brightness to the chord, the thing that makes it major. And actually, the same thing would apply if you played a D minor chord in the same way. The quality of sound note would still be at the top, and therefore it'd sound sad when you play that note. So in this case, it's creating quite a serene kind of sound, especially with the melody that he chose to put on top of this. The first note that he decided to play in the melody is also that F sharp, that quality of sound note. So when you play them together, you get this kind of really calm sound. So it's a really interesting way of starting the piece, and it kind of sets the scene. It sets our expectations for the rest of the piece of music. Now, interestingly, at this point, he's decided to use thirds in the right hand, and this reminds me of the piece The Flower Duet, because in that piece, there's two singers that are singing in thirds. And a third is where you play two notes apart in the scale. So, for example, if you have a melody that is the notes E, D, C sharp, D, C sharp, like I believe it is in this case, if you want to play a third lower than that, then you just play two notes in the scale lower than that underneath it. So two notes before an E in this scale is a C sharp, two notes before a D is a B, two notes before a C sharp is an A, and then a B, and then a final A, and that would give you this. Now, in the Flower Duet, which uses a very, very similar technique, the music almost feels like two people kind of dancing together in harmony. And in this piece, he's kind of replicating that exact same technique, where you've got this calm, serene tenth thing going on in the left hand, and then in the right hand, you've got two people dancing together in this calm surrounding. Now, of course, I don't think Tim has written this thinking I'm going to have two melodies written together that are going to sound like they're dancing together with a calm chord played in tenths underneath it. However, this is the beauty of music. It's finding meaning in the notes that are being played. So now this is super interesting because he's moved to an F sharp minor chord and the piece is almost shifted in tonality. It almost feels like there's a storm coming, or at least that calm sunny day has clouded over. And an F sharp minor chord is chord number 3 and consists of the notes F sharp, A, and C sharp. When anything changes in a piece of music, such as the tonality or the feeling, it's gone from that bright sunshine to that kind of dark, mysterious sound, you generally want to do that very intentionally and find a way of making the music feel like it's shifting rather than just playing through it. And this happens actually quite a lot when people are playing classical pieces. They'll just play through a lot of the changes that are happening in the music and not give any attention to them, which is what's required for a listener to really pick up on it. So in this case, when he's going from this A major chord, it might be quite nice to slow down into the change. And then also in the melody, it's quite easy to throw away some of these notes. But in reality, those notes are all sinking, they're all falling down and adding to that kind of suppressed, cloudy feeling. And so I would try and articulate these notes like they're one phrase, which means to kind of get quieter throughout the notes so they feel like they're part of one thing. It's very easy actually to sort of bash some of those notes. It just requires taking care of the notes a little bit more, even if you have written them. Very nice. He actually played that really, really well, and it's definitely performance ready. There really isn't too much to criticize. It's an interesting piece because it kind of has a linear arc to it. It starts off quite small and quiet, and then it kind of progresses to something that's got a bit more movement, and then it goes back to where it started. It's kind of cyclical in that way. And interestingly, this piece is in the key of E flat minor, which is not the nicest of keys to play in because it has 6 flats. And the first thing to point out in this piece, and the first thing that jumped out to me, is the fact that we have a descending sequence of chords. We've got a bass note that's going down one step at a time. So we start off with an E flat minor chord, and then D flat, but it's also got an E flat in it, which makes the chord a 9th chord, and it adds that kind of suspense to the chord. And then the bass note drops to a C, but it's an A flat chord, and then to a C flat, and then to a B flat. And at the end of this 6-bar sequence, we have a perfect cadence, which means we're going from chord 5 to chord 1 in E flat minor, which is a B flat chord going to an E flat, which makes it sound like the phrase has ended. Now, a lot of the time, when you get a chord 5 going to a chord 1 and it's the end of a phrase, you get something called a dominant 7th, which is chord 5 with the 7th on top of it. So instead of just having a B flat chord, we get B flat chord with an A flat on the top, which then goes to chord 1. And this is actually the chord sequence that we see through the entire piece of music. So it's really important to know how that feels and what effect those chords are having. So for example, chord 1 is kind of setting the scene. It's making it feel sad. Then we have that D flat chord with the kind of suspense note over the top. Then we get it sinking by a half step, but it's a major chord, so it has that kind of longing sound. And then it sinks a half step again, but the chord is actually a diminished chord, so it sounds a little bit more tense before we drop to an E flat chord with a B flat in the bass, the dominant 7th, and then going to chord 1. Having that information to start with gives us a lot to work with when we start progressing through the piece. And I would say, when you do end a phrase and you know that the phrase is ending, especially when you get a dominant 7th like this, it's really important to taper off. Because we naturally anticipate chord 1 again when we hear that dominant 7th, we kind of want to drag out that tension so that when you land on chord 1, it's more satisfying. And this is something that Jules actually did very, very well. He kind of slowed down and eked out that tension. And and then kind of turned the corner back into chord 1 to start the new phrase. Now, when this melody comes in, one thing that I do think Jules could have done more is bring this melody out. As a listener, we already know the chords that we're going to hear because we've just heard them. And once we've set the scene with those chords, they become kind of the background in the image. And now we get a melody, which is the foreground in the image. The melody is the telling of the story, and the chords are the feeling that we're trying to create behind the story. So I do think Jules can afford to bring out that melody a little bit more. And also, interestingly, we don't have to guess, because Yann Tiersen actually has a video of him playing this piece. And in his version of the piece, he does actually put a little bit more emphasis on that melody and bring it out more. And in order to really get the full effect of that melody, there's two things that I would do. Firstly, I would try and get those chords out the way a little bit more. They can be a bit more present in the introduction because they're setting the scene. But when that melody comes in, they really do need to sync to the background so that the foreground can be heard. The second thing I would consider is trying to follow the contour of the melody. So when the melody goes down in pitch, then I would probably try and pull away. And when it goes up in pitch, I would probably try and express more. A bit like if you were a singer and you were trying to sing high notes, it would be quite difficult and you'd have to try harder to sing those higher notes. And because the melody actually is in kind of 2-bar phrases, you've got kind of a little bit of melody and then a held note and a little bit more melody and then a held note. Each time you can kind of taper those notes so that they sound like a sentence. So for example, the first one is... That's kind of the first little snippet of melody, and it feels like it falls to that F. So therefore, we can taper it off to fall to that F. The second one goes much higher and then drops quite quickly, which seems a tiny bit more erratic, so we can express that by playing it out a little bit more. For the most part, these kind of decisions don't need to be thought about too much, because you'll naturally do it if you bring a tiny bit of attention to it. So if you play through this melody on its own, you'll probably naturally know how to shape the melody just by listening to it. But in order to do that, you've got to prioritize that melody over the chords. Even though in reality, you're having to do more with the left hand. It's actually a lot less important. Nice, so already it's super interesting. This song is pretty much based around 4 chords. Those 4 chords are A major, E major, B major, and then C sharp minor. And I believe it's in the key of E major, which already tells us quite a lot of information that we need about the song. Now, I'm assuming that Ferenc said because they learn most of their songs through YouTube that this isn't an original arrangement. This is probably someone else's arrangement. Please correct me if I'm wrong. The reason that I bring that up is because Ferenc said they've also developed a weak relative pitch over the years. And I do have a little bit of an allergic reaction to just copying someone else's playing. So I think you can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone here by working the original song out by ear and creating your own arrangement of the song. I can understand people having an adversity to reading sheet music, but if you like more popular music and you're really not interested in learning to read sheet music, or you just don't find it useful at all for the type of playing you want to do, then that does kind of give you an opportunity to get really good with your ears and start making some super unique arrangements of pieces of music, and all you really need to know is the melody and the chords for that song. So for this particular song, because it's in E major, an E major scale has the notes E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, and D sharp. So the melody is going to be using the notes from that scale, so it shouldn't be too difficult to work out when there's only 7 options. And the interesting thing is, once you have the basics of what chords and what melody are being used in a piece of music, you can really play around with the structure of the piece of music, which is what is happening in this particular version of it. Instead of just getting a normal B chord at the end of that phrase, you're getting like an arpeggio. So there's loads of intricate things that you can add in like that, but also generally you can structure the piece of music so that you start really small, like this arrangement does, and then grows into something bigger. And you also have the opportunity to reharmonize the melody and make it super unique. The other thing is because Ferenc is playing these chords so they're syncopated, which means they're on the offbeat. So you're kind of getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, where the second and fourth chord are kind of jumping in just before the beat. With those particular chords, I would accent them just a little bit in order to make it feel like it's jumping in early. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's that reharmonization I was talking about. Reharmonization is one of the most fun things that you can do as a pianist, especially with pop music, because if you have a pop song that has simple chords, there's nothing that can divert someone's expectations more than changing the entire feeling of the piece of music and changing the chords. And because pop music is so repetitive, so you tend to get the same chords over and over again, a listener has the expectation of hearing those same chords again. So when you change the chords, it makes it really interesting to listen to. And it's really not that difficult to reharmonize a song. All you have to do is change the chord to another chord that uses the melody note that's been used at that time. So for example, if I have a G sharp in the melody, I can use any chords that have a G sharp in them, and that will sound absolutely fine. So you have so many options that aren't necessarily that original chord that was being used, and it's really good for testing your theory knowledge. If you enjoyed today's video and want to see the full videos where I go through all of these pieces in full, then feel free to become a member of the channel. And if you want to see me react to more of my subscribers playing, then head on through, and I will see you there.